Okay, so I chose to do my presentation on the effect of organochlorines on bird physiology. So, what exactly are organochlorines? Well, organochlorines are a group of molecules that are all chlorinated. And you can see that because I included this figure that shows the different types. DDT is the main example, and you can see the chlorine groups that are attached to it. But there's also others such as endosulfan and atrazine, amongst others. And these are kind of common names because they're used as pesticides, which is one of the many uses for organochlorines, as well as being used in PVC and other formations. And all these organochlorines share similar characteristics, such as high toxicity, long half-lives, and they have the ability to bioaccumulate in organisms, which I'm going to get to more here in a minute. And so, just how do organochlorines enter the environment? Well, as I mentioned before, they're largely used as pesticides in an agriculture in order to prevent insect damage to crops. And so, what you'll see most of the time is these pesticides will be applied to these fields, and then what happens is these organochlorines sort of accumulate either in the soil, in the field itself, or when they're present close to rivers. You can see that through the weather cycle, they'll wash into these rivers and become embedded in the sediment. And then that's where the issues really start to begin. And they'll like sort of bioaccumulate. They'll go into these plant life and then to the fish, and then ultimately to the apex predators in these systems where the concentrations get really high. And the reason I included this figure down here at the bottom is because the long half-life can lead to issues downstream in rivers. So when they find themselves in a system like this, where there's like obviously this river continues on down all the way through past these mountains. Well, this is a similar situation here where DDT is applied to all the fields that make their way down through here. Well, due to the long half-life that these organochlorines have in their chemical makeup, what you'll see is that the further down you get, the concentrations start to really get higher, an order of magnitude higher in this study of the DDT concentrations, which just lead to more issues in these organisms that are found there. And so, what effect did these organochlorines have on birds? Well, like I mentioned before, organochlorines can bioaccumulate in animals, and it's why I showed this example right here of the DDT accumulation that starts out in water and then ultimately gets increased 10 million times by the time it reaches the hawk or the eagle, whatever you're seeing here. And these organochlorines cause issues in the animals that they bioaccumulate in, such as eggshell thinning, which many people have heard of because of bald eagle populations, and then altered reproductive systems and mortality. So this slide is basically like the actual mechanism of how it affects these animals. So DDT is what has the most research on it, and so most of these studies are done on it, but this also happens in other organochlorines, but to a lesser extent. So the issue with DDT is it causes delayed closing of these sodium channels, and when that happens, it's not able to, the neuron's not able to repolarize, and so you're going to have paralysis, and then ultimately that's going to lead to death in those organisms that it affects. But there's other side issues that also happen outside of just death. DDT causes inhibition of this calcium ATPase, which is sort of shown here, and that's going to lead to less transport of calcium carbonate into the eggshell gland, and that's been linked to eggshell thickness. And so when you can't get as much of that into the eggshell gland, the thickness of the eggshell itself is going to decrease. And that's what happens down here, as you can see in this image where these eggshells are cracked. And that really affected bird populations because when these eggshells begin to thin, when the bird goes to nest on these eggshells, they crack. And so that's ultimately death of the offspring. And then that's going to lead to lower populations. And then additionally, DDT can cause reproductive issues because it mimics estrogen. And so when it does this, it actually makes the males more feminine. And then the females that it affects don't fully develop their oviduct, which is where the egg actually passes through. And that's like the birth canal for the egg, sort of. And that's obviously going to cause reproductive issues when you can't lay the egg. So the main takeaways from this are that organochlorines are often used in pesticides, and these organochlorines, even though DDT is really no longer used, the other ones that are present, such as atrazine, which is still a really common one, they can still lead to issues, but just to a lesser extent. And that's primarily caused by the long half-life and the bioaccumulation that you can see, because that's just a chemical characteristic that all of these organochlorines have. And as I mentioned, DDT can lead to thinner eggshells and then altered reproductive systems and ultimately death. And this is an important topic, I feel like, because even though DDT has been banned in the US, it's still prevalent in other countries, such as like third world countries and developing countries. And because of that, it really wouldn't shock me to see that other issues are going to arise in these countries where it's still being used. And that's one of the issues that you saw in the US and like most people know about, is that with these bald eagles, where it affected them a long time down the line from just when it got banned, just because the bioaccumulation, how long that half-life is that it's still present in those water systems and everything, and it's going to cause issues in the upper birds, which are the predators, as it bioaccumulates. And so I just think it's something to note going forward, that while the US has banned it, it's still prevalent in other countries, and issues will probably be seen in those countries where it's still being used. And then this section here is just my literature cited section, and that actually wraps up my last presentation.